This is but one of the legends of which the people speak. Long ago, there existed a people within whom a red power lay hidden. They were a prosperous people, blessed with green forests, tall mountains, and peace. But over time, men of great evil found the hidden people and attacked them for their differences. With strength at their command, they drove the hidden people out of their homelands. But then, when all hope had died, and the hour of doom seemed at hand, an exiled monarch, clothed in green, appeared as if from nowhere. Wielding the blade of Sauron's bane, he granted protections to the hidden people, and gave them their own land. What became of that people? None remain who know. Welcome back to The Source of the Rings, where we look at the signs, codings, and real-life inspirations behind characters in the works of JRR Tolkien. Today, audience, was a mess. Discussing this topic is something well worth it, but also incredibly difficult. We're finally getting into some of the more overtly questionable to downright racist inspirations potentially taken by Tolkien as we analyze the origins of the Drúedain. Fans of the adaptations only might be a little bit confused. The Drúedain are not Dunedain, but a separate group of people entirely. They weren't in any of the movies, or, to my knowledge, any of the at least successful video games. They call themselves the Druedain, and are also known as the Rogan, the Ruetani, and the Woses. The Drúedain awoke in the far east of Middle-earth, at the same time as the Three Houses of Edain. If you're a little bit confused about that, go ahead and check out last episode. That should catch you up to speed. Curiously, these physically distinct humans are not considered a House of the Edain, and they were persecuted from the dawn of their existence. The Edain harassed them, causing them to head south of Mordor. When they returned north again, they were friends with the Haladin, but targeted by the Easterlings and the men that would eventually become the Northmen. When some Beorians and Hadorians sailed to found Númenor, they brought some Drúedain refugees with them. These refugees, though, saw the way the morality of the island was going, and left. Into the Second Age, they were persecuted by Númenorians, and had more and more land taken away from them, eventually ending up in what would become known as Drúedain Forest. By the time of the Third Age, they'd lost even more land, and the Rohirrim hunted them for sport, treating them as animals. However, despite this animosity, the Drug chieftain, Gan Burigan, assisted the Rohirrim in the War of the Ring, providing them safe passage, directions, and protection from orcs on their way through Drúedain Forest to the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Finally, for their assistance in the War of the Ring, Aragorn provided the Drúedain guaranteed protection in the Drúedain Forest, forbidding any outsiders from entering the forest without express consent from the Drúedain. Following this, the Drúedain had no further recorded interactions in recorded Middle-earth history, and faded into legend. Culturally, the Drúedain were unique. While most people groups in Middle-earth can be linked to descendants or ancestors, related ethnicities, or concrete origins, the Drúedain were an ancient group of people with no known direct relatives. Yes, they're related to the other men in the way that all men are related in Tolkien, but are generally separate from them, and are not referred to as relatives the same way the Edain are, or the Sinda. Though not necessarily nomadic, the Drúedain are not architects in the same sense as the Gondorians. If they did build massive towns, we know nothing of them, and their shelters were considered makeshift. In terms of art, they were not great metalsmiths, but stoneworkers, they were unrivaled. They made statues that could scare off enemies, they knew as much about plants as the elves did, despite not learning under them, and they used this knowledge to develop both paints and poisons, using the latter to cover their arrows, which they used to dispatch orcs. Outside of language including their own language and limited common speech, they communicated using drums and sharp whistles. They were experts at tracking, hunting, and gathering, and in early drafts of the stories they liked to eat mushrooms, and in terms of liquid, they consumed only water. Physically, the Drúedain are human, but are visually different than the elves and non-Druedain humans that we meet in the story, to the point that we are told that elves and other men found them, quote, unlovely, end quote, to the point of treating them as less than human, and some even, incorrectly we are told, thought that they were related to orcs. They were roughly 4 feet tall, on average, and had wide mouths, deep dark eyes, flat noses, and broad brows. While they had hair on top of their heads and, on occasion, on their chins, they had no known body hair. Their legs were short and thick, and their voices were deep and guttural. In terms of clothes, they only wore grass skirts. Lastly, it is said that they had a kind of innate, mysterious red magic that could make their eyes glow red. Whether or not this is what allowed them to see in the dark, or they were just accustomed to living outdoors, is unknown. Alright, so let's get into coding. First of all, the Druedain being called Woses by the Rohirrim is an obvious reference to the wood Woses of medieval English folklore. The name is quite clearly a shortening, and the Rohirrim, who are partly coded as Old English, using this term, makes the comparison pretty solid. However, I think it's important to note that while they are partially named after wood Woses, just like the dwarves are partially named after Norse dwarves, the Druedain are in no way similar to them outside of living in the wild. Wood Woses are incredibly hairy, all over their body, whereas the Druedain have no body hair. Wood Woses are filled with madness, but the Druedain are some of the calmest, most reasonable characters in the trilogy. Wood Woses are unable to speak to other people and are quite dangerous, while the Druedain are actually rather helpful. The perception that the Rohirrim have of the Druedain is definitely similar to what the medieval English authors thought of the mythical wild men, but the Druedain themselves are extremely different. They are extremely human, and the Wood Woses are not so. This took me on a bit of a trip, metaphorically, around the world to see where the codings might take inspiration. Primarily, the Druedain are an ancient people, counting their identity further back than any other surviving group of men from the time of the War of the Ring. Secondarily, the Druedain are coded as indigenous. Their land that they have held for thousands of years is regularly stolen by invading armies with more developed technology. And then, there are non-thematic codings. The use of poison arrows is something found almost exclusively in rainforests, with a couple of desert-based and Mediterranean exceptions. But remember, the Druedain are forest dwellers. The grass skirts further indicate a warmer climate, and the preference for mushrooms leads us to look at hunter-gatherer societies that like mushrooms, rather than agricultural societies. The drums, the rock art, the whistles, the lean-tos, and then there's the physical description, roughly 4 feet, wider and flatter facial features, little to no body hair, but these aren't hobbits. I believe the Druedain are coded after Central African foragers. Now, real quick, as the term by which this geological group of people is more widely known is not the preferred term, I will say it once and only once. We are referring to the people commonly known as, quote, African pygmies, end quote. Other names for this group of people include African rainforest hunter-gatherers and forest people of Central Africa. Although individually, if you're talking about a group of people, you're best off just referring to the specific group of people by their tribal name. Though, despite speaking different languages and living in different countries, these people groups share similarities in ancestry and culture and are often grouped together. Don't get me wrong, I recognize that the Bambenga are not the Bambuti, who are not the Batwa, but I believe a mixture of these cultures, all of which contribute to the geological grouping, inspired the Druedain. Bear with me, please. First of all, I'd like to get the conversation about physical appearance out of the way first. I've seen it argued online that, as the text doesn't describe the skin color of the Druedain, but it says that the elves and other men do not find them lovely, it is racist to headcanon the Druedain as black. Let me say this. It is not racist to recognize that wider noses and larger lips have been associated with people of African ancestry more than they have been associated with people of non-African ancestry, nor is it racist to recognize that larger noses and wider lips are actually found in a lot of people of African ancestry. That is just how facial features trend across continents. It is most definitely racist to say that those facial features are ugly. It is most definitely racist to say that those facial features are unique to black people or that all black people have them. It is most definitely racist to say that those facial features make a person less valuable. It is not, however, racist to acknowledge the Eurocentric standard of beauty Tolkien had. Regularly, throughout his writings, when characters are described as beautiful, Tolkien will highlight their pale skin. Some of the heroic characters may have brown skin, like Sam and Tom Bombadil, but the ethereal women that enchant men with their beauty are either not given a skin color or are specifically light-skinned. There is an intentional effort by society to value white skin as the most desirable and black skin as the least. In one of Tolkien's personal letters, he even acknowledges that Europeans have a Eurocentric standard of beauty. So, while it is absolutely racist for Tolkien to say flat noses and wide lips make someone unlovely, I don't think it's racist to recognize that the forest-dwelling foragers that average 4 feet tall, use poison arrows, make rock art, play drums, and trace back their identity thousands of years in Tolkien's world, resemble the forest-dwelling foragers that average 4 feet tall, use poison arrows, make rock art, play drums, and trace back their identity thousands of years in the real world. It's also worth noting, and though I will get into this later in the series, they are compared to and thought of to be related to orcs who are described as having dark skin. That's a whole other can of worms, but my point is people compare them to another group of beings with dark skin. The Drúedain being treated as subhuman and being hunted as animals is similar to how Central African foragers have been dehumanized and hunted and discriminated against for generations, not just by Europeans but by other Central Africans as well. In fact, the narrative of the Drúedain never seeking war but being on the receiving end of atrocities, though, again, not allegorical, definitely feels like a parallel to the struggles of indigenous people worldwide. This narrative acknowledges that colonizers dehumanize the people whose land they colonize, and I will give some credit to that even though I still reject Tolkien's Eurocentric standard of beauty. However, there's a difference between characters dehumanizing indigenous populations and narratives doing so. So often in media, Central African foragers are portrayed as childish, unintelligent, and animalistic. To Tolkien's credit, his characterization of an indigenous, pre-metalworking society is comparatively positive. Just like the Central African foragers are, he portrays his foragers as incredibly talented, brilliant botanists, survivalists, and artists. They are wise and discerning and have great morals. As they haven't developed guns or automobiles, Central African foragers are often thought of as unevolved, but just because their way of gathering food, which, I remind you, still works, is ancient doesn't mean that their society is backwards. According to anthropologists, for centuries there has been much greater equality between the sexes in Central African forager societies than there was in contemporary societies from around the world. A lack of economics or industrialized material possessions is not synonymous with a lack of dignity, so I do think, again, it's positive to refute that association. The Druedain speak in broken English, which isn't great, and they are regularly put down by the Rohirrim, but as far as humanity is concerned, they are treated with respect. However, even if we ignore Tolkien's Eurocentric beauty standards, this portrayal of an indigenous forager society is not without problem. Though Tolkien avoids the stereotypes of dangerous backwards natives, he relies on a different stereotype, one less obviously racist, but still unacceptable: the noble savage. See, during and following the Industrial Revolution, many white people developed an appreciation for the indigenous people from the lands they colonized, and for their way of life, viewing what they deemed a more primitive culture, though I would describe it as a culture less focused on technology and development, as superior, or at the very least, holding some elements better suited for the natural man. This isn't inherently bad by itself. It doesn't end there, though. The concept of the noble savage dehumanizes indigenous people, similarly to how the traditional imperialist views the native population as a monolith of animalistic criminals. The traditional primitivist views the native population as a monolith of virtuous peacemakers. Neither view the population as human, or at least as human as they view their own population. Indigenous people are not perfect. Sometimes the equality found in a culture will be better than in another, but every ethnic group is composed of individuals. Individuals can choose to murder or go to war, to be selfish. They can choose to heal, to seek peace, or be egalitarian. But it is this choice that is so important. By portraying a group of people as inherently good, perfect by design, unable to sin, you remove what makes them human. This is an important distinction. Choosing to do good is not the same as being innocent. Perhaps it is simply because relatively little time is spent in Tolkien's writings on the Drúedain, but they are, though certainly human and wise and empathetic, not complex. Save orcs, every other group of sentient beings in the Legendarium with more than one representative is able to have representatives with differing moralities, differing motives, or differing opinions. Again, it's possible that this is just because of a limited number of page appearances, but the Drúedain are a monolith. A good, noble monolith, to be sure, but a monolith all the same. We know Tolkien was opposed to the Industrial Revolution, so I understand wanting to critique that, but there aren't even conversations between the Drúedain. They're simply present. I don't need there to be an evil Drúedain or anything, there's no evil Ent, but the Ents at least talk to each other, have disagreements, need to discuss at great lengths how they plan to proceed. The Drúedain, ironically, though being humans, are more of a force of nature than the Ents, who are tree shepherds. There is a lot of good in how Tolkien portrays the Drúedain. He rejects the notion that pre-industrialist means unintelligent or backwards. He portrays the dehumanizing nature of colonialism. He provides coding of an underrepresented group of people. But there is a lot of not good as well. He reinforces a Eurocentric standard of beauty. He relies on a stereotypical view of the morality of indigenous cultures, and he portrays an ethnic group as a monolith. The Drúedain have great potential, but as it stands, are a bit of a mess. It's not a mess I would call difficult to fix, however. In fact, it really would be quite simple. Include another Drúedain with speech. Have someone express disagreement with Gan over helping the Rohirrim, because of how they have been treated in the past. Or perhaps have someone else express an interest in joining the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Show this group of people as an actual group of individuals, rather than a singular entity that represents nature, but just so happens to speak through an avatar. And, of course, if you're going to include the part about the elves and Rohirrim finding them, quote, unlovely, end quote, make it clear that that is a bias, not an objective observation. I understand why so few adapters of The Lord of the Rings seem comfortable including the Drúedain. Done incorrectly, they could easily become stereotypes, or perhaps I should say more stereotypical than they already are. However, given how King Aragorn, who is kind of supposed to be like the ultimate right at the end of the story, gives back to the Drúedain the land that was stolen from them, and says that if any further communication is to happen between their people, it will be through mutual consent, I think the message on anti-colonialism surrounding the Drúedain deserves to be told. It just needs to be told delicately. Amazon, if you're listening and you want to include Drúedain in your TV show, may I recommend hiring writers from the people groups you intend to code the characters as? Oh, and also, if you are hiring, I'm available too. Oh, and treat your employees better. Everybody that is not Amazon, thank you for listening.